deCaires Narain with us to talk about Caribbean literature. Of course, a topic like that where we don't have particular book to focus on, very general, and it's often quite dangerous to talk in these very general terms about a topic which is as vast as the Caribbean seas, but we have the best guide we possibly could have asked for. And so let me just start at the very beginning, Denise, and ask you for a working description, a working definition rather uh, of Caribbean literature, because there are different opinions, aren't there, about what you would include in that.
Yeah, and I guess I should first of all say that I am ashamedly monolingual. So right away, my engagement with the Caribbean is constrained by the colonial language of the region that I grew up in and where I'm from. So there's that kind of that's obviously the first step, I think. The other thing to say is that I'm actually quite cold. I'm not nervous, I'm just cold. Uh, no, no, no. So if I get very cold, I'm expecting my husband to donate his jacket and his socks. So just a warning. Um, the first thing is the kind of colonially inherited linguistic divisions, and I guess the second is that it's quite a volatile space in terms of its geography. So it sort of follows on quite well from the previous session, um, in that many of the islands are very small. Many of them are battered by hurricanes. Many of them are are volcanic and have had volcanic eruptions fairly recently. Um, so it's quite an unstable kind of geography. The coastline is constantly shifting. The Prime Minister of Barbados is very active and vocal in global climate change initiatives because her island is is one of those that may be under threat and so on. Um, in terms of the imaginary of the Caribbean, can you interrupt me if I talk answer too long? Okay. Um, so yeah, many of the region's writers have engaged with the particularity of the Caribbean geographic situation. And Edward Kamau Brathwaite, a Barbadian poet, has this image in one of his poems, which goes something like the stone had skidded, arced, bloomed into islands, and then it goes on like that. But he's taking the metaphor of a skipping stone and the kind of randomness of where it lands as a kind of metaphor for the fragility of the Caribbean. So that's the other dynamic. Another dynamic is the fact that most people who live in the Caribbean are not from the Caribbean in any kind of long historical way. Um, when I was going to school in Guyana, we had this narrative about the indigenous people that they were just all exterminated. And it was kind of a way of not even acknowledging that there were many native peoples, Amerindians, and not even Amerindians is the wrong term, because within that group there are many different kinds of Amerindian peoples. But it's amazing how much we internalized that kind of colonial idea of who qualifies as a human subject. So I'm sure you know that the Caribbean is populated by indigenous peoples of various kinds, but also by tiny minority of Europeans who had a ginormous impact on those places, particularly in terms of the demographic of the region. So enslaved people brought from various parts of West Africa and beyond, indentured laborers from India, indentured laborers from China. My own kind of mix up ancestry includes some Portuguese, Portuguese, mainly from Madeira, who came as indentured laborers to work on the cane plantations too, because they had some knowledge of cane plantation in their own in Madeira. Uh, and so it goes on. So everybody is from elsewhere. So I think the impact that had on the literary scene is that it tended to make each particular group feel that it had to make a particular claim to its original place before coming into the mix. So just one final point maybe is that the Caribbean is often spoken about as this place of hybridity, a kind of happy hybridity, whereas I think it's a much more tense and fractious kind of hybridity, which maybe is even a more productive kind of hybridity anyway. You know, yeah.
Right, right. And the fact that you are from Guyana, uh, would you consider the output of your nation to be part of this Caribbean canon?
Sure. I mean, Guyana gets included in the Caribbean, in the Anglophone Caribbean, because it was colonized by the British. So Guyana is nothing like Barbados. St. Vincent is nothing like Barbados, and so on. So each of the islands has its own particularity, but Guyana is kind of a very strange anomaly because it's part of the South American landmass, but we all kind of lived apart from the Amerindian peoples on this tiny strip of coastland, which was below sea level and which relied on the Dutch, just again thinking back to the previous session, for a very elaborate system of polders and canals and so on. And in Walter Rodney's book about the working classes of Guyana, he has this wonderful statistic, but because I'm absolutely rubbish with statistics, I can't give it to you. Basically, it's to say that the amount of mud that had to be shifted, the millions and millions of tons of mud shifted to make plantations work, was done by enslaved people, many of whom would have died in the process of producing that. So, yeah. So Guyana is a kind of anomaly, but it produces all the best cricketers for the West Indies team, or at least it used to. Um, but yeah, so culturally, it's very much part of the
Right,
Caribbean.
right. And don't worry about statistics and names because that is not what we are looking for in a session like this. We want our ideas cleared with you because we are happy to have you here and you could help clarify some of our notions, maybe. And our session is about the Nobel winners from the Caribbean and looking beyond them. So let's come to them and would love to have your view about whether you consider them to be a blessing who've actually made this new world literature more popular, or do you see another side to that story as well?
When I saw the title for the talk, being an academic, I immediately started unpicking it. So I started with how does it go again? The Isles?
The Isles, I think, yes.
Isles. So,
Caribbean Ink.
right. So the Caribbean ink is great, but the Isles already, it seems to me, has a kind of tropical, sexiness about it that I think maybe distorts. So I'd want to maybe shift that. Um, and then the Nobel winners, it just seems like such a distant thing to me. I mean, everybody in the Caribbean was very proud of both Nobel laureates. Obviously, a lot of national pride in St. Lucia, a lot of national pride in Trinidad, and across the region. So they weren't just hailed by their particular nations. But I think very quickly, um, Naipaul managed to write himself out of favor with some of the later works, but even the earlier works, even the ones that he is beloved for, like A House of Mr. Biswas, I think many people working in Caribbean literature were already smelling a very large rat, in the sense that there was a kind of deeply ingrained racism in the very few black characters that you find in A House of Mr. Biswas. So I think his reputation in the Caribbean has always been contested. The Nobel kind of lifted him up a bit, but it didn't kind of change the terrain very much, I don't think. Walcott, I think, has had a much more lasting legacy in that I think any poet in the Caribbean, whatever their particular kind of form, I think is always quite reverential to Walcott. So even though he is often talked about as a very Euro, very European in his form. Sorry, when I say European, I keep remembering a poet who always says European as a way of trying to stress the rope in Europe, and I can't quite get it out of my head. Um, but I think so. I think there was some kind of discussion about Walcott's more kind of formal, the formal nature of his poetry and so on, that is quite conventional, and so many people preferred the more radical trajectory of someone like Kamau Brathwaite and those who followed with dub poetry and things like that, a more kind of rhythmic Creole, you know. But Walcott is still, I think, revered, even where poets don't follow in his footsteps. I think they recognize something about that poetic sensibility that they can't shake off in the way they may be able to disengage from Naipaul. Yeah.
Right, right.
Sorry, I had
It's
actually one other thing. The other thing that the emphasis on the Nobel Prizes does is it doesn't allow you to think about or it invites you to think that Caribbean literature began with these two male giants, and it didn't. Long before, or even at the same time as them, there was Jean Rhys writing amazing fiction. And if you know, I mean, she I think has had a very, even though she's a white West Indian with um, slave ownership in her grandfather's past, she has been incredibly influential on Caribbean writers, male and female. So in a sense, I would want to say there's a before the Nobel that perhaps has a more sustaining kind of impact.
right. But these are the people that most members of the audience would have actually, if not studied, at least certainly heard about to a great extent. And who are the people, the contemporary writers you'd want us to read?
Gosh, there's so many. Um, I think the contemporary scene now is actually quite hard. If the Caribbean was hard to define initially in the ways I outlined, I think the contemporary situation is made even more complex by the profound impact of diaspora on Caribbean writing. So many Caribbean writers live elsewhere, but many of them only ever write about the Caribbean, and they have a very big impact on the direction of travel of Caribbean writing. So I would name writers like Jamaica Kincaid, who writes from the States, but writes always about Antigua and colonial history, um, and who took the name Jamaica Kincaid because she comes from a very small place. And when she first started writing, wanted the anonymity that a small place doesn't allow. um, Jamaica Kincaid, I would say Dion Brand, I would say Marlene Nubis Phillip, I'd say Olive Senior, Grace Nichols. I mean, okay, those are all female, I just realized. But there are one or two good male writers too. You'll be pleased to know there are a few. But I would say that the post 90s, I think women have had a much more extensive and visible presence, an audible presence than male writers. I think that could be backed up. If I were a statistician, I might be able to prove that to you, but I'm pretty certain I'm correct on that. I want to be correct anyway.
No, it's good to hear all the female names, and of course, along with race and class, gender is the other plot point in this very complex graph, isn't it? And here, I'd like to bring to everyone's notice, I'm sure many of you know already, of the path-breaking work that you did with your contemporary Caribbean women writers making style. You actually sculpted, you actually made canon where there was none. You were contouring a canon, if I can put it that way. Would you
But
like to say a little bit about
but even that, now I would look back and I would do it completely differently because in a way I was sort of not forced, but coerced by the lack of attention to women's writing into producing a kind of counter canon to the canon. Really, ideally, I would have preferred to have taken a more promiscuous route through those writers, you know. So in a way, I was kind of defending and retrieving women. I think it's a stage a lot of feminist work has to go through to bring to the foreground, you know, writers who are not known about. But I suppose my biggest the biggest critique I would make of that work is that it is too anchored in the work of Kamau Brathwaite and Derek Walcott. So these two writers who the path was either go the European path with Walcott or go the Afrocentric path with Kamau and write in Creole. And so I think it's a much more sinuous way you can navigate those paths. And contemporary writers are doing that. So there's a very interesting poet called yeah, she's a very interesting poet called Vani Capildeo. She actually now goes by the name Anthony Capildeo. She's someone of Indian ancestry from Trinidad. She's moving all over the place in terms of her cultural references. Yeah. Okay, can I hold the mic? And don't think so.
A little more Caribbean than it was before. And it is cold.
Yeah.
It's
Sorry, I was told I should tell some anecdotes, and I was going to start off with the one. Have you heard the one about the governor? But I thought that might be a bit risky, and I still have 2 more days in Kolkata, so I'm not going to tell the anecdote about the governor. But yeah, so I would just say that contemporary writers are moving more sinuously between those traditions. So ideas of canon and canonicity and lineage and pedigree, all of those things I think are being much more complicatedly dealt with via queering sexual fault lines, bringing class more visibly into the narrative and so on. So I think it's getting, this phrase mashup is getting mashed up in really interesting ways so that, you can't plot a route from a poet's work to Kamau Brathwaite or Walcott. It's all kinds of other positions in
right,
between.
right. And when you're doing collective studies, that's one side. And then you have your monograph on Olive Senior and the special journal issue on Shani Mutu. And of course, that uh, there's that risk of that you study them in that exclusivity and you're decontextualizing them in a way. But that also needs to be done because these authors, I mean, you can do the death of the author once they've actually lived in the reader's consciousness, and these authors need to first do that. And it's thanks to work like what you're doing that enables us to to see them living in their works. All right.
As a rule, I think, again, I don't want to sound like I'm pulling the rug from under my own academic career. But now that I'm retired, actually, I don't care. So I'm going to pull the rug. I think single author scholarship is not something I would do again because it kind of almost traps you in being very reverential to the author, and it does treat them a little bit like God, even if you are critical and so on. So I would much rather teach or read in a more complicated kind of context,
Right.
where you put writers together or
Right.
thematically or whatever. Yeah.
Right. And this brings me to the book that I'm waiting to read, the one that you're working on now. And it's not only on the Caribbean, it's on Indian authors, it's on African authors, diasporas, and it's called Strange Intimacies, representing the servant in post colonial literature, isn't it? Would you like to say a little bit about this book? I found it fascinating.
So unlike the other two, which I'm pulling the rug from under, this one I'm still slowly building the foundations for. So it's been taking a long time. It's because I was very interested in finding a way of thinking beyond the kind of broad sweep of the post-colonial, really, because the post-colonial tended to get a little bit hung up on differences between particular ex-colonies and the center, or so. I mean, that's the kind of simplify it, and post-colonial studies is much more complicated than that. But so I wanted to find a more, I suppose, a domestic context. I wanted to look at differences between women within domestic spaces. And the more I looked, the more it seemed to me that relationships between servants and the women who employ them really produce quite complicated and difficult questions for feminists to answer. And I counted myself as a feminist, I still do. And I just found, yeah, and part of the problem of writing about it is trying to navigate across this sense of difference and who do you have the right to write about and how do you do it? And I think you should do it and you should attempt to do it. But I'm still navigating that because servants feature so prominently in so many texts. They're everywhere in colonial history. Colonial, well, from India, from wherever, that servants were absolutely these key figures, in between power and yeah. So particularly reading memoirs of former colonials, the way they speak about their servants is as like one of the family. Of course, they're not like one of the family. So I'm interested in those tensions and ambiguities and the trouble they cause for women, really. Yeah.
And I can't help feeling that you need a different theoretical framework altogether in order to uh, understand in any sensible manner this very different, distinctive body of work. And there's so much more that I'd like to ask you, Denise, but I think I must open the floor. We are running a little late to questions, if there are any. Any questions? Hands up. If yes, I think. Could we get a microphone to the young gentleman there?
Yes, I am Sandeep Banerjee, film TV artist, news reporter. Here I am. Uh, and my question is to you that in your Caribbean ink, could Robindronath Tagore, the Indian famous novelist writer, will be included?
Sorry, I didn't get your question.
Uh, can you talk about Robindronath Tagore, about his famousness in your discussion?
Tagore.
That's
Okay.
pushing it a bit. I I mean, I have read a little bit of Tagore, but I certainly wouldn't be able to. I think I could make a claim that he is very important to Caribbean writers of Indian descent, and the story of indentureship is one that is still being told, just like the story of the Black Atlantic crossing and enslavement is still being told. But I think in some ways that story of enslavement and the Black Atlantic has perhaps eclipsed the other story of indentureship. The Guyana where I come from is the population is there is a larger number of Indo Guyanese than there are Afro Guyanese, and the same is true in Trinidad. And I'm currently judging the Guyana Prize for literature, for fiction. And it's quite striking how many of those texts are by Indo Caribbean writers going over some of that terrain that has not been represented in Caribbean literature. So one of them is about village life on an Indian plantation. And the other one, which does have a Tagore epigraph, is about an indentured woman coming back to Calcutta, actually, with her two children and finding that she cannot adjust to um, Indian life in Kolkata, and within 4 weeks goes back on another boat to rejoin her husband in Dutch Guyana. So that's a long-winded way of saying I think Tagore is there as a kind of canonical reference point for many, many Indo-Caribbean writers. And maybe one of these days, hybridity will mean that other ethnicities will make claims on Tagore too. I think that's quite likely and quite possible.
Right. There was a question.
Hi, so this is Shyn. And since we are talking about identifiers, we are talking about race, we are talking about class, we are talking about gender, and post-colonialism as one string that links the Indo-Caribbean diaspora. Do you think climate refugees, or do you think an ecological imbalance that's obviously the concern of the world right now? That's also one of the identity identifiers that is kind of finding its way into literature, and that's also one of the factors that maybe will be able to link all of these diasporas. So, just to give you a background, obviously, as a law student, this was one of the researches that I did, loss of cultural heritage with climate refugees. And that's where I come from. Like, you know, I want to understand whether climate refugees would be that string of thought connecting the Indo-Caribbean diaspora.
Okay, that's quite a big question. And again, I'm not sure I have an answer, but I think what I'm seeing in a lot of the very new writing coming out of the Caribbean is a much, much greater awareness of ecology, of environment, and of climate. I mean, Olive Senior has always written about nature, So she has a book called Gardening in the Tropics, which might sound very sedate, but is actually very much about the kind of the devastation caused by colonial practices of plantation slavery and so on. So I think it's there as a kind of submerged, eh, relatively submerged theme, but it's becoming increasingly coming to the surface. Whether that is enough to join diasporic, we'll wait and see. Because I think one of the things that is happening alongside that eco consciousness and eco poetics that some people are speaking about is a kind of commitment to indigeneity and for indigenous peoples to are sometimes the ones leading the narrative about change, because they have often been the ones, certainly in the Caribbean, who have been excluded from political narratives, have been excluded from state practices. So they're very much at the forefront of that kind of attention to ecology. Um,
We will take one last question.
May I ask a question?
Yes, I think we.
Hello, I'm Arima, and incidentally, I also used to be Debnita ma'am's student, Sri Shiksha. Yes, ma'am. So I was fortunate enough to have gotten an opportunity to teach students in Guyana as online sessions, taking university classes for them. Now, in one of the sessions, I was talking to the students, and one of them mentioned when I was talking about the post-colonial dynamics, and I remember the student said that, ma'am, generally when we talk about a rebellion or like going against the scheme of the colonial enterprises, generally we see that Haiti as one of the island nations in the Caribbean, generally we see that the official history highlights the Haiti rebellion. But do you think somewhere Guyana is underrepresented, both in terms of the literature that has been produced or going by the further like the dominant narratives that come out of of the Caribbean as a whole, like, do you have the inner politics, like places like Jamaica or Barbados, because of the Nobel aspect as well, the Nobel Prize winning authors coming out of these nations? And also because Guyana, to some extent, I've sensed that tone of regret that maybe they're not represented enough in the literature of the Caribbean. So I would really like to know about your views on that.
Absolutely the right person to ask this question to.
Yes, ma'am.
um, I kind of initially in my career, I sort of moved away from the Caribbean because I really got fed up with all the kind of inter island, are you a big island or a small island? Are you mainland? Are you this? Are you that? And I just found it very, very restrictive. So, in some ways, the post colonial not forced, I wasn't forced to do anything. I wanted that kind of broadening, and it did do that. So, I think that moment for that kind of I'm from this tradition or that tradition, I don't think it's as strong. I mean, maybe you're picking it up from speaking to students in Guyana, and probably if I was teaching in Guyana or in Barbados, I would come across some of that sense. I think Guyana is actually represented quite strongly in Caribbean writing. It has Pauline Melville, it has Wilson Harris, Grace Nichols. It has a whole range of writers who have internationally recognized profiles, but perhaps more importantly, regionally recognized profiles. I think the difficulty too that in speaking about being on the margins. So you didn't actually use that phrase, but I'm using it. In judging this Guyana Prize, many times the people who submit pieces have said that they just don't have the opportunity to be published and so on. But sometimes when you read the submissions, they cannot be published because they're not worked enough. They need to be edited. They need to be rewritten. They need to be to more reading to enhance and inform the writing. So I'm kind of a bit wary. I mean, something Damon said earlier chimes with that sense that, that maybe sometimes it's not good writing, or that there isn't enough attention to form or whatever. So that's another little caveat I would put into the mix. But I think otherwise, I think Guyana is quite well represented within regional people who know about Caribbean writing will know Guyanese writing and will know that it has a kind of distinct um, eco-poetics, if you will. So someone like Wilson Harris, his book opens with the river. His very famous book, The Palace of the Peacock. Rivers are really important in Guyana. They're enormous. They're now finding oil off the coast of Guyana, and that's causing huge ecological concerns for many, many people. So, but that's a horrible way to become international, is via, the Americans coming and taking the oil and devastating the landscape. The other thing, finally, is that reading populations in the Caribbean, the population of the Caribbean is small. Again, if I was good at stats, I would give you a quick summary, but I can't. But it's tiny. It's nothing like Calcutta, for example, and that's just one city in India. So, and within that, reading populations, and there are all kinds of historical reasons why that is complicated. But the reading population is quite small. So the readership readership and writing go hand in hand. So I think the problem is a problem of something this guy called Razak said on the earlier panel about a culture of reading and taking reading as something more than just entertainment. I think that's something that hasn't quite happened in the Caribbean yet. So people are still, I think, reading often the Bible or books that are kind of romance fiction, very kind of easily read. I have nothing against romance fiction, but I think we don't have that complex reading culture that might sustain and elevate into notice that the writers more. I don't know if that answers your question, but
Right. Your answer and the rivers in your answer ties this session to the last one. And I think we'll end on that synchronized note. So I know most of you are waiting for the musical program after this, not Calypso Beats, but very Bengali. And
I hope I made a good sandwich though. If I was the filler, I hope I made a good sandwich, right?
you did, you did. Thank you very much. Thanks for